Hi, and welcome back to the Working Class History podcast. As you may know, we don't get any sort of funding from any wealthy benefactors, corporations, governments, or political parties. Our work is funded by you, our listeners and readers, on Patreon. In return, our supporters on Patreon get access to exclusive content and benefits, like ad-free episodes, bonus podcast episodes, and a couple of exclusive discussion podcast series, fireside chats, and radical reads. So here is a little preview of our latest episode for our patrons. You can join us, help support our work, and listen to the whole thing today at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. I did ask Daniel if he got a job at Starbucks deliberately on behalf of the IWW in order to start trying to organise it, which is known as being a union salt.
No, there was no IWW effort at the time at Starbucks. I just started working at Starbucks because I needed a job, and that's where I got hired. A lot of folks have been curious over the years, were you a salt? Did you go and you salt Starbucks? And I say, no, it's not that I went in as a salt. But the but is, as I just explained, I was a wobbly. I was a committed member of the IWW at that time. And, most certainly as a committed IWW member, it was never, far from my mind, wherever job I was at, I would be ready to stand with coworkers, ready to demonstrate my values of solidarity and all those things. So it's neither that I was a salt nor that I was, not a unionist at the time. So yeah, that's kind of the rub on that particular question.
In the main episodes, Daniel discusses the macro climate of the time. Perhaps because it's so relatively recent, it's not really something which gets discussed that much. Although in the last year or two, that whole decade from the early 2000s has become a subject of, some might say, undeserved but wistful nostalgia for some on social media.
IWW Starbucks Workers Union, right? Organizing gets started in 2003, goes public May 17, 2004. It's at a very specific time, right? It's before the smartphone is really out there, certainly the iPhone. It's before social media, right? It's at that really interesting moment before we really have a shift in the communications landscape and, writing completely different context, but the writer Hua Shu speaks of this era, right? This kind of Gen X era, frankly, elder millennial era of it's kind of right before social media and generational shift fully to millennial generation. This is a really interesting, I think, moment, as every moment is, but for unionists and union builders. I work with workers in many different industries today with the union building work I'm doing with the Solidarity Union Network. And of course, we focus on, what's in our control, what can we do? But ultimately, we're operating in a larger general political, economic, labor, technological climate. So we have to be aware of and move within that. I guess you could call it macro would be the jargon, or big picture climate, and do what we can within it and then try to impact it as well. So 2003 was interesting in that, this was really when this political and economic system called neoliberalism was ascendant, right? This is a big word. I don't know who made up this word. We constantly stumble with this neoliberalism word, but it's the one we have. And how it was expressed there in that era was just global corporate power asserting itself through these international bodies, right? That folks have heard about: WTO, IMF, NAFTA, a word soup, World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, North American Free Trade Agreement, essentially international vehicles for global corporations to degrade the working class, weaken unions, gut social protections, and essentially dominate the cultural, political, economic, social life, right? 90s were on fire for this mode, and now we're in the early 2000s where it's just really, really come to dominate. One impact in the US is that manufacturing work was decimated, right? Not solely through this, but large part of the story. So many of my mentors, for example, happen to be steel workers from Youngstown, from Pittsburgh. So they are thankfully mostly living example of this kind of devastation as manufacturing was really decimated, and it was service work. Not that service work was new, but it was new that service work had really now come to dominate the US economy, right? So we were service workers in that moment. What we were experiencing in fast food and retail, journalists, writers were starting to kind of put it out there to a more general public. This is the era of Fast Food Nation comes out by Eric Schlosser. Barbara Ehrenreich writes Nickel and Dimed. Naomi Klein writes No Logo, just to give a kind of sense for those that are kind of more book inclined. Stuff that we were experiencing kind of had those cultural products. There is that Adbusters flag, the American flag with all the stars or corporate logos, right? So this is the era that we're in. Traditional union organizing, when it was attempted, was beyond falling flat. I mean, this is really a extreme low point of unionism in the history of the United States. This is the backdrop where Starbucks Workers Union comes out of. We're also in the George W. Bush era. Some people tell me they're trying to rehabilitate George W. Bush. I will not be one going along with that.
It's very much a testament to the horror of our current situation that many people nowadays are lionising Bush, a mass murdering war criminal, because I guess at least he didn't embrace neo-Nazis and fascism and didn't want to abolish democracy in the US. But he did help lay the foundations for the authoritarian term we see today, and he was certainly no friend to working people.
He and his National Labor Relations Board were obviously relentlessly opposed to basic worker rights and went to work full steam ahead, strengthening corporate attacks to deliver like the death knell against union organizing. Aftermath of 9/11, immigrant workers in particular were hounded or rounded up, repressed, Patriot Act era. Um, and something that might not be evident for folks, union builders today, because this is improved, then there was an enormous gap between many left progressive movement efforts and labor and class struggle. There was more than a few old heads in the movement that they're very worried. Like, is class going to be like abandoned by this rising generation of activists? I remember the old timers, they would shower like a lot of love on me because they're like, "You're young and you're into unionism. Like, this is good. We got to talk." It was probably a little exaggerated that that class would be discarded, but there's a reason that folks were feeling that.
At this time, there was a lot of talk about the working class being dead, we are all middle class now, and the like.
There was a tremendous gap between many progressive struggles and the labor movement. So it was really a very interesting backdrop there for the Starbucks Workers Union. Those are some of the headwinds, but there's also some energy we were benefiting from. There was an incredible global justice movement. Global, so much of the most exciting elements of it were in the global South, but it was also very active in Europe and the United States. We have the Zapatista movement as well, which had impacted many. Many are familiar with.
The Zapatistas are indigenous rebels in Chiapas, Mexico, who rose up in 1994 and reclaimed their ancestral lands. You can learn more about that in our podcast episodes 88 to 89. That brings us to the end of this episode preview. Hope you enjoyed it. To listen to the full thing and help support our work researching and promoting people's history, join us today on Patreon at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. That's patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. Catch you next time.